Could we please come to order? So my name is David Korn. I'm the Vice Provost for Research of the university, and I've had the wonderful privilege of working with Max Bazerman to put this symposium together. I don't usually write things that I'm going to talk about, but I have a little bit of time, and I did write some things down. We're here this afternoon to hear about emerging scientific insights into how we arrive at our judgments, choices, and decisions, and to learn that much of our brain's processing that leads to these choices and decisions takes place beneath our awareness. This processing has been described in several ways, for example, as implicit cognition or deliberation without awareness. These insights, derived originally in the psychosocial and behavioral sciences and more recently buttressed by the neuroscientific identification of specific neural circuitry in our brains that's involved in this processing, are of profound importance in helping us to understand, among many other things, why physicians so steadfastly deny that the deluge of strategically directed pharmaceutical company gifts and favors in which they often bathe can possibly affect their choices of therapeutics and medical devices. Or why leading academic economists deny with equal vehemence that the substantial funds they earn from their consulting practices can possibly affect the advice they provide directly to our government agencies or indirectly to the public in the op-ed pieces they are solicited to author by major news media. Although in both circumstances, financial conflicts of interest have caused terribly adverse events, I personally find the denials of economists especially intriguing, given that their discipline rests on the axiom that financial stimuli powerfully influence human behaviors. These insights also raise special challenges to those of us who are educators to discover what combination of explicit and hidden curricula will raise the awareness of our students and trustees and trainees and hopefully guide them to deliver more independent and authentic professional decision-making than they may have witnessed during their education and training. Universities occupy a place of privilege in our society, not only for discovering, transmitting, and transferring new knowledge, but to serve the needs of a public for independent arbiters of knowledge, a phrase that I first heard articulated by Al Gore when he was in the U.S. House of Representatives in the 80s. Financial conflicts of interest, undisclosed and unmanaged, threaten this independence and threaten, as Harvard Law professor Terry Fisher recently put it, our universities and our faculties' capacity for attestation. As many of you are aware, a good deal of activity directed at financial conflicts of interest has occurred in this university in the past 2 years, leading, among other things, to a new university-wide policy adopted by the president and fellows about a year ago. And in the Harvard Medical School, where the decision has been made to substantially tighten that school's long-standing financial conflict of interest policy, which was first issued in 1990. Other schools are in the process of implementing the university policy, and my office has been impressed with their seriousness and their diligence. Against this backdrop of intense policy activity, it's indeed a special pleasure, indeed a treat, for me to welcome you to today's symposium that I believe will provide a sound scientific foundation for the legitimacy of our concerns and our policy responses to them. It's now my pleasure to welcome Max Bazerman, who will moderate the seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for creating this event. I met David, and I actually met Reed, who's part of the panel, a few years ago when David was the president of the Association of American Medical Colleges, and I had the role of one of the panelists on a somewhat similar session to what we'll be working on today. And when David showed up at Harvard University, he asked me to serve on the university's Conflict of Interest Committee that created the most recent new policy. And after the policy was created, David then approached me about creating the event that you're sitting at today. And since we put this session together in rough form, I want to just highlight 3 interesting episodes that have occurred. One, some of you may have been following the episode involving Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway. So David Sokol, who was one of the potential candidates to replace Buffett, turns out he bought an awful lot of shares in a firm and then played a role in having Berkshire Hathaway acquire that firm. Apparently, he disclosed the fact that he owned shares to Warren Buffett when he first formally suggested that this company be an acquisition candidate, and Buffett acknowledges that he was told that, and his comments about Sokol since have been roughly limited to saying that Buffett's convinced that Sokol did nothing wrong, and no comment has been made about ethicality. Another interesting episode is that in the wake of Lehman Brothers collapse, as part of the financial collapse, we hear about Ernst & Young potentially playing a significant role, where Ernst & Young did not act on some very strange accounting practices. This occurs a decade after Enron collapsed and Arthur Andersen was implicated, and we've had many other episodes since, and many would claim we reformed these issues when we created Sarbanes-Oxley in 2002, but the same problem doesn't seem to go away. And finally, as David alluded to, we have a professor on our campus in fine standing, a former senior administrator, who it turns out was writing about the improvements in the Libya government at the same time that he was receiving fees from a consulting firm who was under contract to the Libyan government. What I want to suggest, after sounding somewhat negative, is that I believe it's quite possible that Buffett never did anything intentionally wrong. I also believe that it's quite possible that the auditors for Ernst & Young, who okayed the accounting, may not have known that they were doing anything wrong. And I also think it's quite possible that a professor who has a conflict of interest would be under the belief that his opinions cannot be bought, and therefore there was no issue. When I was growing up, my father was a low-level inspector for the US Defense Department, never made much money, but between the ages of 17 and 14, between the ages of 7 and 14, I saw roughly 25 baseball games a year at Forbes Field in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and very good seats. The defense contractors simply liked my father and often gave us tickets to the baseball game. My father was a nice man, and he assured me that his judgment could not be bought. And I believed my father that he believed exactly what he was saying. Today's symposium is not focused on the concerns of explicit corruption, but we're interested in what Larry Lessig might call institutional corruption, and how we set up our institutions affects the psychology of the people who are making those decisions. So for me, when I think about the Ernst & Young episode, I'm far less critical of the people making decisions at Ernst & Young on the specific case of Lehman than I am of the people at Ernst & Young who may have lobbied to create the institutional structures that allow subsequent decisions to be corrupted. Today we have a phenomenal panel of amazing experts who are going to take us in the first 2 talks from some of the more basic psychological processes that affect conflict of interest. We'll have a short break, and then we'll have 3 additional talks that are much more closely tied to some explicit issues associated with conflict of interest. And our first speaker is my excellent colleague from the psychology department, Mahzarin Banaji, who is a Richard Clark Cabot Professor of Social Ethics and is also the president of the Association of Psychological Science. As many of you know, Mahzarin's research focuses on human thinking and feeling and how it unfolds in social context. Her focus is primarily on mental systems that operate in implicit and unconscious ways, and I think that that will provide us useful background for the talks that follow as well. Welcome, Mahzarin.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you, Max. And I also want to say thank you to the SAFRA Center for supporting this, and to Larry Lessig and the many people at SAFRA who've really made it possible for people like me who had never thought about things like conflict of interest to begin to do that, because they've made those opportunities available to us to do. I just want to say that conflict of interest, as I've been reading and thinking about it in preparation actually for a semester next year that I will spend at the SAFRA Center on leave, as I read the literature, I see discussions about it that I would say have a focus that is either statutory or moral. So when we talk about in any country like this one that believes in the rule of law, when you talk about conflict of interest, you're talking about things like when somebody uses public or professional office for private gain, and the language that is usually used and the focus tends to be statutory or moral, and I'll just give you a couple of examples. So this is the one that I'm most familiar with, giving preferential treatment to individuals or organizations as a function of conflict of interest. And one that Larry Lessig has actually pulled out and made central to this mission is to look at all the ways in which conflict of interest in some way adversely affects the confidence of the public in the integrity of the institutions that they need to reach out to. And I was remembering today just something that came to my mind that I'd forgotten for years, that a black woman who's a friend of mine and a doctor, when she heard that I was an organ donor, said to me, "I would never do that. I would never put an organ donation sticker on my ID." And it took me several minutes to figure out what she was trying to say to me. So here we are, and to talk about what science can do here, and I just want to say that I don't think the right thing is to now add another to the list of the ways in which we should talk about it, but I do think that what science can do is give us the evidence that can inform the way in which the statutory and the moral descriptions of what conflict of interest is all about can happen. And so I actually will just begin by saying that this is sort of the organ that I have been interested in some way, mainly in the human mind, but in the head of very ordinary people, in part because we've known that there is, in fact, Reed is going to do a lot more of this after me, so I thought I would give you in like 5 seconds the millions of years worth of evolutionary history that many of us scientists believe has brought about the ethical systems that we tend to rely on. And our thinking basically is that ethics arose from the emergence of something called self-awareness that happened along our evolutionary path at some point, that therefore ethics and the way in which we rely on it to make our decisions is closely tied to the appearance of what we would call consciousness, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that. That something happened where eventually we got cortical control over our motor activities, that there were connections that were formed between our frontal lobes and our limbic system, that these were all important in the path to getting to where we have the system of ethics that we currently do, and that this provided our ancestors with an ability to be able in some way to act, to understand that they have goals, that they have motives, that they have intentions to do things, and that they do this not just alone, but as social beings. And finally, from that, we think that something that we might call an ethical system is what evolved. And I think that I'm not too far from expressing to you what might be a very general consensus of how it is that we have now this system that helps us understand what good and evil are. when you talk about good and evil, it's hard not to think about the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court plays such an important role in making either and both of those happen. And when you think about the Supreme Court in the context of conflict of interest, it's very hard not to think about your favorite justice and mine, Justice Scalia, who is famous for a 21-page memorandum that he wrote in 2004 in response to a request that he recuse himself in this particular case, in which, at that time, Vice President Dick Cheney was in question. Knowing that the court had just accepted this case, Cheney went to Louisiana to hunt ducks with Dick Cheney, and came back believing that, and exactly as Max said, ought not to have any impact on his judgment. He said, if it is reasonable to think that a Supreme Court justice can be bought so cheap, the nation is in deeper trouble than I had imagined. And I'm here to say that if we have a justice who believes this, then we are a nation in deep trouble. And that the problem, that, as I have seen it, has been ours. The problem of people who understand anything about these issues, the fact that a smart man like him can say something like this, I think squarely points the finger at people like me, and says that we simply haven't done a good job of educating people about what we know about our science. But in the last 2 or 3 years, I've begun to feel that maybe a little bit more of the responsibility ought to shift to people like this, because everybody's talking about these ideas. These are no longer concepts that lie buried, in the trenches of psychology labs and basements of tall buildings. Instead, this is something that David Brooks is writing about, and Malcolm Gladwell is writing about, and people like Nicholas Kristof write about, and so on. And so it seems to me that these ideas are out there, and so now I'm willing to say, well, I think the responsibility is a shared one to actually understand what these sciences are teaching us. So that's Justice Scalia and his comment in a case where I think most people in this room would say there was something very obviously that we would call conflict of interest. Okay? But let me give you another example, and this is a little bit different. I get this from a colleague of mine, Paul Vegard, who's a philosopher and who's very interested in what science has to say about these kinds of concepts, like conflict of interest. And Paul's example is one from his hometown of Waterloo in Canada, where the city decided to put aside, to get a loan for $112 million from a firm that we'll only refer to it with the initials MFP. And it turned out that in the last draft of the document that was signed by the city officials, the number that appeared that they were taking a loan for had jumped from 112 to 227. The two individuals who signed off on behalf of the city said that they had no idea that they had actually signed off on something that was twice that number. And yet, their names are Stokey and Ford, these were the city officials, but these city officials, there'd been a history of entertainment by MFP, and the court in Waterloo, at least, held these two people, they saw the company as having done serious wrongdoing, but they also believed that Stokey and Ford had actually done something wrong, not intentionally, but they did say that it must have been the case that because of this wonderful warm feeling of having been entertained by MFP, that these folks did not actually look through every single page as carefully as they might have. This surprises me when I read something like this, because this is a standard that I don't think we're typically used to. And the question for us today is going to be, is the science telling us that Justice Scalia's position is the right one, or this other court in Canada that made a very different kind of decision? Because they believed that these two individuals who are public officials were indeed giving preferential treatment in some very unconscious, very implicit way, and that in some ways it was eroding something that they hold to be very central, and that is that public service is a public trust. So why are we all so clueless? Why is it that we're clueless about conflicts of interest when because I assume that every single one of us in this room has been involved, not in serious kinds of conflicts of interest like this, perhaps because we don't have the same kinds of powers, but most of us, I would argue, have succumbed to these at one time or another, and probably fairly regularly. Okay? So the answers that I'm going to give you are in three parts. The first one I'm going to argue is simply that much of the way in which the mind and the brain do their work is not something that is accessible to our conscious awareness. And I'll say that many of us have this feeling that so much of what we do actually does happen in conscious awareness, that we do believe that this is the way in which we typically think, and human beings are special. We can do this. We are the envy of every chimpanzee because we can do this and they can't. But this is a very teeny sliver of the way in which our minds actually work. Okay? The ability to be able to take a proposition like this and turn it upside down in our heads is actually a very rare event. Okay? Much of what the brain does not happen in this kind of conscious form. Whoops, let me go back. And what real scholars who've studied how the brain works, Eric Kandel, people like John Barge who've studied consciousness for over 30 years, will tell you is that when asked, how much do you think does this beef with electricity passing through it, how much of it do you think does its work, how much of it happens in some form of within conscious awareness and conscious control? And the answer you'll get back from them is something like a fraction of 1% of the overall amount of work that the brain does. So I think that these are simple facts that, again, we might want to know, because in what Max described as these events, whether in Lehman Brothers or the Warren Buffett example, I think what we're talking about are very particular aspects of what we do cognitively, and I'm not even yet talking about emotion at all. I'm just keeping this cold to say our processes of attention, how we perceive and how we reason and remember and so on. We now know that there's vast amounts of distortion that happens very early in the process, so that by the time it surfaces up to where it becomes conscious, the decision has already been made. And I'm going to just skip over some of these to tell you that we in our own lab have taken to devising tests that we can put on a website so that people can actually take a test to look at whether they're able to be fair. Okay? Can you associate, let's say good and bad, with two groups, your own and some other group? And in some cases, you should have no worry when you associate your own with good, even if it's the Red Sox, and it's hard for people in Boston to actually produce any kind of association of positivity with the Yankees compared to the Red Sox. This is not a bias that bothers anybody, and it shouldn't bother you because it matches up very nicely to what your conscious bias also is. But the difficulty, of course, arises when you do not wish to have a tilt in one or the other direction, and the data come out showing that indeed that is the case. So for those of you who are interested, I just put this up there. You can go take these tests, and you can actually make them up yourself. And if you have a conflict of interest moment, I would actually say, take a test. And I say this seriously because people do believe that for the physical body, that there are ways in which we can know what's going on inside our body. I'd never claim to understand how my kidneys actually work. Okay? But I have a feeling that I understand how my brain works. And that decision is just false. Okay? Just as I have a little gizmo that I can attach to my wrist and know what my blood pressure is, I think that we have now rough gizmos. By the way, this one's reliability is about the same level as a blood pressure machine's reliability is. It's about 0.65 or so. And so one of the things that we can talk about, if you're interested, is whether tools like this can be used to inform judges, ourselves, before we make decisions as to whether there is a pull that is taking us in one or the other direction, not consciously, but at another level. So that's just a plug that gizmos might actually be available that can be used. The second piece that I want to put before you that I think is crucial to our discussing conflict of interest is the point about the centrality of the self to us. Right? The self just wins every single time. Self-love really knows no bounds, except in a few people who are deeply depressed, who are very accurate, but do not necessarily have the same levels of self-love. But we love everything about ourselves, including the letters of our name. So if somebody gives me the letter M along with an equally frequently occurring letter in the language, I will prefer M over it. So things that come to be associated with me also come to have this warm glow of me. Objects do. Certainly other people do. And this is another place where I think conflict of interest issues are things that we should take quite seriously, because these feelings are very, very hard to stop. Okay? You find yourself veering in the direction of the person who has eyes like your mother's. And it doesn't even matter what your relationship to your mother was. You just do like people who have eyes like your mother's. And these are, again, very simple, very basic facts about how our minds work that we ought to be aware of. Max, how much time do I have? 10? Oh, great, okay. So let me tell you about a study that Jason Mitchell here did some years ago, in which he introduced people to two individuals, okay? And these two individuals were similar to them in almost every way but one. Okay? One was a Republican, the other was a Democrat, but otherwise they were ordinary college students with ordinary desires to do well in school, to go away on spring break, and so on and so forth. What Jason did is to put people in a magnet and to simply scan their brains while they're answering questions that have nothing to do with politics. So the questions were things like, how often do you think John does his laundry? Every month, every week, every year. How often do you think Matthew goes dancing with his girlfriend? Things like that that have nothing to do with a person's politics. And one of the results that came out of that study that was surprising and noteworthy was the result that when people thought about the politically similar other, these neurons in the ventral part of medial prefrontal cortex were the ones that were active. This is a composite picture that I'm showing you of many different brains put together. On the other hand, this more dorsal part of medial prefrontal cortex was active when people thought about the different other. Okay? So in our sample, this being the People's Republic of Cambridge, most people were liberal. So for them, the other happened to be somebody who was Republican. But in the small number of people who were Republican, you get the same pattern of data, except that for them, it's the Democrat who provokes that particular pattern that you're seeing there. So first of all, I think it's extremely important to know that the brain is assigning different parts of neural real estate to doing the job of thinking about people who are different from us in their beliefs, just how they think about the world. And that's enough for us to begin to start to differentiate in this way. The reason this result is of greater interest is because these particular neurons in medial prefrontal cortex have been identified in many other studies as being involved when we think about ourselves. Okay? And so what these data tell us, at least tentatively, is that when people are like ourselves in some way, when something in their heads that's invisible to us matches what is in our heads, okay? That there is an automatic and unconscious sense that they enter some kind of moral circle that we will say is us or me, okay? And that others who don't have that property remain outside. Other work that Jason has done shows that you can change this, that by making people take the perspective of the other, you can break this down. So the system is malleable. And I think that when we talk about things like conflict of interest and the unconscious roots of it, it's often very easy to become fairly pessimistic and to ask the question, well, what am I supposed to do about it? And how can I even begin to take control of this if it's happening at that level? But I do think that there is a sufficient amount of evidence suggesting that there is a malleability here that is important for us to recognize and to know that to get ourselves out of the troubles that we create for ourselves, that there is a conscious system available that might allow us to do a fair amount of work to be able to achieve that. The third thing that I want to say to you about how we might think about conflict of interest based on the research evidence that at least I have seen is that there really is, at the implicit or unconscious level, there is really no neutral. Okay? We were astounded. In the early days when we were doing these studies, we thought, let's find something that nobody should have a preference for. Okay? So let's have people look at words that are simple consonant, vowels, consonant strings. Why should DAX be any better than whatever is after DAX? Talk. Okay? But it is. If you give people a test, DAX will outperform talk. It just will. There isn't anything that is neutral. You could pick any two of these and throw them into this test, and you will get a systematic effect. And it may have to do literally with the frequency of the letters, with how they sit next to each other, their orthography. And think about the larger world out there and the shapes and the colors and all of that that sit outside that can provoke from us feelings of approach or avoid, a sense that we want to be there and try it or not. And that's what I mean when I say that John Barger's work and the work of many other people who've done really magnificent work tells us that it would be silly for us to really speak about something called neutrality at the unconscious or implicit level. Okay? That's something that we can try to achieve at the conscious level. Okay? but it would not be possible for us to say that we can do that when our subcortical regions are engaged. So we have worked on these three different psychological concepts largely, on something that we've called preferences, and we measure just the association of good and bad with different things, and I can show you, if I had time, I would show you evidence that these pop out very naturally. Our beliefs about the truth value of things. Think about another way in which I think conflict of interest issues might arise. The brain is a believing organ. Okay? When it sees something, it assumes that it is true. It takes a lot of work for it to disbelieve something. And that's an extra step that most of us hardly ever are able to take. And finally, of course, most things in the world come to be at different levels associated with ourselves. And these three things, we believe, can actually predict almost everything about what we like, what we dislike, which fields we will enter into, what professions we will have, the kinds of people that we will gather around us, and so on. So I'm going to say that although we are not in quite the same momentous moment as the discovery of the telescope or anything like that, I do think that there is a moment when people who are not scientists are going to have to look at this evidence and decide if there's something here to be done with it. Because it ought not to be scientists alone who decide how to take these data and turn them into something else. That would be a real mistake, to let scientists alone be part of that discussion. And so when you think about that moment in our intellectual history, when telescopes began to teach us something about ourselves that we did not think could possibly be true, Richard Panik, who wrote a very lovely little book called Seeing and Believing, How the Telescope Opened Our Eyes and Minds to the Heavens, he says it's not so much about how it worked that people worried about, as to what it revealed, how to interpret its momentous revelations, or even whether to interpret them. And I have to say to you that over the last 20 years, this is a consistent question that we have received about the evidence that we're finding. Why would you even go in that direction? Why would you? And I think that that's an interesting question, and I think that if we want these data that are not the most pleasant data about ourselves, to do some work for us, then it needs to get out of this laboratory and into the hands of a broader group of people who know how to think about these in ways that we simply don't. So a few months ago, when I gave a talk at the Safra Center, a bunch of questions came up that led to a study that I'm going to tell you about. And the best way to tell you about it is to probably tell you that it was done with 3 people, Larry, Mo, and Curly. And the 3 of them and I see people who are under 60 years old did not laugh at this at all, and I can see why. The 3 of us ended up doing a very simple study in which we gave subjects a description of a disease or a couple of other things. I won't go into the details of all. This is just a very ordinary description of this particular kind of cyst. And what we varied was the following. At the end of that paragraph, it said a Reuters survey of doctors from a representative sample of hospitals in the United States that pay their doctors in accordance with the number of surgeries they perform each year. It wasn't highlighted in this way when subjects read it. It simply appeared as part of the sentence. So in this case, what we're saying is that there is the potential for conflict of interest. There was a second condition in which there was no conflict of interest, where that sentence was replaced with the one that said pay their doctors a fixed salary that is not dependent on the number of surgeries they perform. And a final condition in which we made no mention of pay structure at all. Okay? Now, after people have read these, and there were several different ones, I'm just giving you an example of one, they're also asked for their judgments of how much trust and how much confidence they have in these systems, okay? And in these people. So they're asked questions about those particular doctors that we wrote the scenario about, doctors in general, and then your doctor. How much do you trust your doctor? And I'll just show you the data because I don't know how many of you want to, what do you want to bet? Do you think it changes people's view of doctors at all? Okay. But what about your own doctor? Would it bother you if you simply heard, you saw what that was. All you had was a simple one sentence that doctors in that hospital or whatever, that group, are paid by the surgery. And then if we say to you, do you trust your own doctor? Should it matter? Okay. You guys are too smart, so I can't fool you. But all right, we think that most people, in fact, we have some evidence that most people tell us that they don't think it should matter to people. But in any case, so what you have, this is confidence about doctors in general. Having read that one statement, what you see is this. In the high conflict condition, less confidence in doctors in general, in the neutral and in the no conflict condition, higher, significantly higher. And then we had other kinds of categories, and you'll see the same kind of data there. So the doctor data you just saw, but also take a look when it is consumer research, you see the same thing. In the high conflict condition, much lower trust than in the other two. Politicians are interesting because you notice that the high conflict and the neutral condition actually produce lower ratings. In other words, the neutral, when you hear nothing, you just assume the politician is corrupt. So what you get is something no different than what you actually see in the high conflict condition. You actually have to be told that they're not corrupt and for you to have a slightly greater sense of trust in that group. But here are the data for own doctor, and you see pretty much the same thing, slightly less prominent, but still, your own doctor, your trust in your own doctor diminishes when you have just read a paragraph that talks about some doctor somewhere there in a survey who are paid by the surgery. Okay? All right, so I'm going to actually skip over these data and end by saying that, when we put this together, and the next sets of studies that we're going to try to do are studies that are going to look at people's associations of various properties with money and how that might predict other kinds of ethical decision making that these people will perform and so on. So this is a project that is just about to begin. But I got involved in it because Larry and others said people haven't shown this, that they would be surprised by this. And I think that we assumed that this was not going to be surprising at all until we ourselves saw something here that seemed interesting, and that was that confidence in your own doctor is diminished when you hear about some doctor out there who might be taking, who's being paid by the surgery rather than a flat monthly fee. So a very interesting person by the name of John Erskine at Columbia University in the last century wrote an article in which he said, why are Americans so obsessed with the fact that people ought to be good? Why don't they care that people ought to be right and that people ought to be smart? Why do they underprivilege smartness and doing the right thing compared to their belief that Americans ought to be good people? And I think I'll just end with something that he said, which is that if we have not exhausted every opportunity to know whether what we're doing is right, it will be no excuse for us to say that we meant well. And if you know of a way for me to email this presentation to Justice Scalia, I'll be happy to take your suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahzarin. We're going to reserve questions till the end of the session today and go and continue on with our other talks. Our second speaker is Reid Montague, who's a professor of neuroscience at the Baylor College of Medicine. Reid work centers on human social cognition, decision-making, and willful choice with the goal of understanding the detailed underlying neurobiology of these functions in health and disease. And he's connected the brain to issues of conflict of interest for quite a while, and we're glad he's with us today to share his work with us. Welcome.
Thanks. So you can see by my affiliation up there that I'm with the Baylor College of Medicine. Actually, I moved 3 months ago to London and to Virginia. So, well, how would you know, right? I don't even know I'm there. So thanks for inviting me. This started for us. I'm a neuroscientist who began his career studying synapses and making computational models. I now find myself in the airy heights of social phenomena and imaging brains. One of the things that we've contributed to this area is we've been able to image multiple brains at once interacting. Anyone interested in that, call me up. We do all kinds of interesting tasks, both overseas and in scanner clusters that I build in various places. But I'm going to talk to you about just a couple of things. The first is valuation. And what I will do is I'll go back and forth between behavioral data and neural data, not to show you, not to prove that, obviously this isn't magic, it's coming out of your brain, because they're images and activations that you can track in functional imaging devices. It is that in many cases we're learning a lot of things about different regions of the brain and the functions that they contribute to, what damage do these regions do, and it's a way to sort of back out, in a sense, what you can see in terms of incentives. So for example, abstract incentives, in large part, gain control of, by various connections, lower level regions of your brain that we share with every vertebrate on the planet, even those that don't even have big cerebral cortices. All right, so that's my sort of disclaimer. I start with this because it has Krispy Kreme donuts on it. Do they have Krispy Kreme donuts in Boston? Do you guys know what that is? Okay. So Krispy Kreme donuts were not around for hunter-gatherers. They are composites of sugar and fat and salt, all baked into an annulus, a torus for the mathematicians in the audience, that is warm and hot and juicy, and you always eat at least one or two more than you should and feel sick afterwards. There's an inertial term with Krispy Kreme donuts. Your nervous system doesn't know when to stop. It's attracted by these cues associated with the donuts, the aroma, the fragrance, the experience, and it doesn't tell you to stop until it's too late. You go past that threshold and you feel sick for about an hour. All right. Humans are influenced by the acquired value of a lot of things in the world. I've drawn up my favorite 5. Actually, I shouldn't say that. Actually, I would have said that 10 years ago, but now that I'm middle-aged, putting Viagra on there is a little, telling. The point is, as you look at that, think to yourself, why is it that I value the Mona Lisa? And in which ways do I value the Mona Lisa? What levels exist? From the abstract to the mundane. You may like the smile on the face down to the colors in the painting. Okay. All these things compile into coherent behavioral responses that you may make about it. So when you talk about external incentives, I offer you money. It's never done, and I think we got the sense of that, the sort of spirit of that in Mahzarin's talk. It's never done in a vacuum. There are lots of influences, okay? So I'm going to talk about simple experiments, but with an eye on the fact that valuation in your brain is predicated on a whole lot of things, not all of which we've even identified yet. Well, valuation is the antecedent to decision-making and choice, right? How do you choose between two alternatives in the absence of being able to differentially value them? In the absence of being able to differentially value them, you can't choose between them. There's a book in the late 60s by John Barth called The End of the Road. It's a little sleazy, sort of raunchy book. But in it, there's a character called Jacob Horner who realizes in a train station that he has a disease and he can't differentially value the world around him. He has a flat value function over everything. And he sits frozen on a bench thinking about which train he should take. If I take this train, it could be a little bit late. If he takes that other train, it's a little bit long. It's the local train. It stops at lots of stops. He starts to smell hot dogs. He's hungry. Well, if he ate, he'd get the hot dog stand, but he heard about somebody getting sick. And he goes on and on and on and on and on. This kind of cyclone of indecision because everything was equally valued. And he got frozen in the bench, okay? You have to assign differential value to things, and you have to do it in a certain period of time. Right? An animal that doesn't do that, that just sits there going through the decision tree, we're not related to those animals. Okay, so these are the 2 questions I'm going to ask. How do favors influence valuation, and what are the underlying substrate? And by favors, I mean just what you think I mean. Here's the usual setup, right? A dollar sign goes across, and some commodity comes back. I would call these reciprocating exchanges. So implicit in the idea of a favor, typically, is the idea that you either get something back then or you're loading up a proxy for something in the future, okay? Here's a list of things that might be. I make you a personal loan. I call somebody up for your kid. I give you a gift. I show you affection. I show you a proxy of affection. I glance at you. I smile at you, whatever. These things all influence the way we value interactions with other people. But these aren't what we're talking about in terms of favors. In a sense, this is a truly economic exchange, even if you're talking about the various things we've written here, all of which are the basis of various Russian novels. So, and they are, right? And you know what I mean. They are, because that is part of the human condition. These things affect us. We care about them. We fight over them. We write tragic stories about them, and we start wars over them, okay? But I think it's reasonable to say that these are all in the sort of economic ledger balancing domain. even if you think something's not coming back to you, you're still often willing to do a favor to someone. So in that sense, I'm introducing it this way because I want you to think of the favors I'm talking about as very open-ended. Somebody does a gesture to you or some entity does a gesture to you, and there's no expectation of payback, and there's not even a route for payback. Okay? When we go looking for these things, we already have, and we put people in scanners, and we do functional imaging on their brains. We already have good candidate neural systems. I won't belabor the technical parts of it, but one are dopamine neurons located in your midbrain. There are about 25 to 30,000 neurons per side. They're the only source of dopamine to your striatum and to the region to your brain, basically. There's a small projection into your pituitary gland from your hypothalamus. But other than that, this is a source of dopamine in your brain. It's involved in motivated learning, motivated decision-making, action, the valuation of various behavioral opportunities to you. They are hijacked by every drug of abuse, and they're the neurons that you lose when you get Parkinson's disease. Okay? They're really important. If I remove the dopamine neurons from your midbrain, you act as though the world and your actions have no rewarding consequences to them at all. You die, basically. We know a lot about these systems now at a very low level, recording single unit activity in these neurons. We have pretty good differential equation models of the kinds of information they encode in their spike trains, and we can design experiments around these ideas. So these are a good system to start with, because these are the systems that we think give sort of behavioral power to abstract ideas, to incentives, to external incentives. I offer you money. How is it that offering you money coerces your behavior to go left and not right? Okay? I have sort of framed them as part of what we call a ventral valuation system. I want to show you a picture here. Do I have a, yep. So this is the side of my head like this. This is the corpus callosum connecting the two hemispheres. So when I say the ventral valuation system, it's about three particular regions. One here in the midbrain. This is your brainstem here, and here's your cerebellum. This is where the dopamine neurons would sit. One of their main targets is a region right here called the striatum, which is a collection of structures formerly thought to be involved in the sequencing and selection of actions, now known to be involved in the valuation of actions, and the valuation of sequences of actions, and the valuation of reward consequences to what you're doing or what you might do. And then a region here that Mahzarin mentioned, this is the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. This area of your head, this is right here between your eyes, the thing that gets damaged if you're in a car wreck and you bang your head on the dashboard. And if you lose this region, and there are famous patients studied by Tony Damasio now at USC, who have terrible troubles making decisions. They don't have trouble framing the decisions or the choices available to them. They have trouble tipping the scales over and choosing one choice amongst the variety of alternatives that are offered. Well, a whole lot of experiments are going on. I've summarized imaging experiments in humans. I've summarized basically up to the mid-2000s. Oh, sorry. I've summarized up to the mid-2000s. But as you can see here in this glass brain, this is a view from the side, and this is a view from the back, showing it's tightly clustered basically between your eyes and the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. And you see across a wide array of dimensions, brand preference for drinks, odors, Coca-Cola versus Pepsi, the beauty in paintings, what kind of beer do you like, sports cars, money, amounts of money, money early, money late, et cetera. This region is intimately involved with the valuation of things, including mental states, we think, including internal mental states, like is this idea better than that one, or what do I think? If you lose this region, you have a really hard time dealing with things related to the differential valuation on these axes. We also, and I just indicate this by writing in two classes of error signals that we know are encoded in these neurons. We understand these error signals pretty well, and people design very detailed experiments around them. Error signals that guide your behavior, that guide your choice. So we know a lot about this system now. Obviously, you know, it's an area that's grown too large to summarize in the short time I have available here. Okay, so those are passive experiments. I sit you in a machine. I show you pictures of pretty people. I show you different kinds of beer. Maybe I let you choose one or the other. You're not actually getting it, but you're just making passive choices. We're looking at your brain. But what about the choice that we started with first? The one where the ledger is being balanced between the two people interacting. One that involves reciprocity. I'm just going to show you one little punchline result from a multi-round game that we call the multi-round trust game. And in it, there are two players. One's a proposer, here called the investor, and the other is the responder, called the trustee. The proposer is endowed with $20 every round of the game. They can choose to keep the $20 and the round is over, or they can send some fraction to their partner. On the way over, it triples, as I've noted there. You pay some amount, and it triples on the way over to your partner. So suppose you have $20 and you send 10, it triples to 30. Okay? Now the responder has control, and they make one decision. How much between 0% and 100% do they send back to the proposer? Okay? Suppose they send 15 back. Proposer has $25 in their hand now. The responder made $15. Okay? Round over. They're re-engaged. This goes on and on and on. Okay, so we've done this in over 2,000 people, and we've scanned over 850 brains. Anything I tell you is it's the largest fMRI study in the world that I know of. It's the largest fMRI study in my world. Point is, I understand these signals very clearly in the context of this game. I want to point out two things. Number one, I've written up here. That is that we can track in this experiment signals in lower level regions of your brain, in the striatum, right? We can track signals that are related to abstract plans for future movement, for future investment in your partner, okay? I say that because when you start talking about external incentives, and I know some of the following speakers are going to talk about how do you set external incentives so that people aren't in conflict, we're never going to be talking about just talking to the sort of rational us or the institutional us or the socially encultured us. I mean, these kinds of ideas and abstractions get access to low-level structures in your brain that make you do things and influence you in ways you may not be able to get hold of. I think it's only by marrying that kind of knowledge at both ends that you can design coherent policies on it. I don't have any policy suggestions, just as a disclaimer here. So let me just draw your attention to the result. So here is the punchline. So if you go looking in the brain during this exchange, you can say, well, how do people behave on the task? Modally, they do tit for tat. If I go up 10% across a round, you follow me. If I go down 10%, you follow me. Okay? This goes on. The big signals in the task are when you deviate from neutral reciprocity, which is what that is, where you go benevolent or malevolent to that. We can use that to go find sort of reciprocity deviation places in the brain. In other words, show me the place where those signals are deviating a lot that sort of goes off, and that's the big social signal in the game as well. So when you look at the behavior, the thing that makes you change your behavior is whether somebody deviated from neutral, from neutrally following you around. That will change the behavior on the game. And the behavior here is how much money do you give your partner. This is all taken from data where people are playing anonymously. We've also played cross-culturally, and you can imagine all kinds of other add-ons. What I'm showing you here is the time series of activity. Well, this is the Safra Center, but this is, I'm going to show you a few real traces. So I'm showing the time series of activity in this region of the brain during the time I'm indicating here. So here's time on the x-axis, and this is percent signal change on the y-axis. I've just shown the averages. So each one of these points is 2 seconds apart, okay? The black, and this is when the investor submits their decision. This is covert to the responder. There's an 8-second blank period, and then boom, what's been submitted, the decision of the investor is shown to both brains. And that's what you see right here. Okay, what you can see is that the black trace differentiates from the red trace quite clearly here, and only here. I've separated the two traces not according to what's happening now, but according to what's going to happen 22 seconds into the future. So when the trustee has decided on the next round they're going to go up, when on the next round they do go up, it's already differentiated in their brain way before they make the action. And let me just point out one other little thing here. If you notice, the investor submits their decision here. The trustee doesn't see it until here, but this differentiation goes on before that. So what I've shown you is data taken here when I know the trustee has built a model of their opponent. We think, in fact, they built a model and they tend to actually ignore real data on it. This is the sort of, why do you see Snoopy in the clouds? Well, you see a lot of Snoopies. Well, there's another question, which is, can you only see Snoopy in the cloud? And in fact, that's a good question that you can start asking neurally here, which is when you get overtrained on who someone is, or when you come with a lot of biases, like my prior on the politicians was exactly what Mahzarin's data showed. I thought, yeah, my prior is, okay, politicians corrupt, and maybe they differ from there, right? And so that's what those data suggest. So these data suggest that you might track this actively in human heads while you're doing that. Okay, so what does this show? It's a very abstract exchange when you make a reciprocating exchange with another human being, but we're recording in the striatum. Birds have striata. Animals, rats have striata. Animals that barely even have a cortex have striata. Okay? And they use it to go around the world and navigate and make good choices that get them food and keep them alive. Okay, this is a direct probe, reciprocity, as we said. And that's the way the game looks. Your behavior in one round is based on the behavior that you had in the last round, and based on your opponent's behavior, and this goes on. You're very much entangled very quickly. It becomes a complicated task to disentangle in terms of what we're looking at. But here's what we want to look at. We decided we wanted to look at a favor where someone does a gesture to you, and as I've indicated here, with no return pathway, there's no reciprocating path back, and the impact of the favor is going to be read out through something that shouldn't make a difference, which is the way you like pieces of art. Okay? This is the thesis work of Anne Harvey, who is sitting right there, and I'm going to make her stand up. Please stand up, Anne. Okay, thank you. This is all Anne's thesis work. It was a quite intrepid thing to do this was at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, where people think the smartest animal is a rodent. So, I mean, studying human beings and studying this was quite brave of her. So here's the background of the abstract art task. There's no right, there's no objective answer, there's no reciprocation. That is, I'm going to have somebody give me money for doing a task, and then I'm going to put something that represents that somebody near various pieces of Western art. And I'm going to ask, does that change the way my brain values the art? Okay? And there's lots of variance across people. Here's the paradigm in the scanner. It's pretty simple. Art comes on and stays on for 5 seconds. There's a randomization between that, and that's it. Okay? You see a whole bunch of pieces of art. In this particular case, and we can come back to this, we handpicked the art. It was good. It's a very pleasurable task to do. If anybody enjoys visual art, it's a very pleasurable task to lie in the scanner and just look at art. The people that were doing it were not told anything else, though. It's essentially a visual system experiment to them. And there's no perspective encoding. We're not saying, please look at this art and tell me what you think of it or anything like this. Just look at the art, okay? Then afterwards, they get out of the scanner, and then they're re-queried as to whether they want to do a separate experiment. And the separate experiment is to sit down and see the same sequence of art at a computer terminal, this is outside of the machine, and to rate it between -4 and +4. Then what we do is we go back in and we ask, well, I'll show you how we do it. So what we do is we go back in and we say this number that people assigned to each painting and when they assigned it to each painting allows us to build a regressor for each individual brain about what to expect in terms of the brain response to the valuation of the art if it was going to be used to assign this number, even though we weren't saying that. So we're looking at passive brain responses to the art, and we're using those to ask, could we have predicted the numbers that people subsequently assigned to it? This gives you a sense of how we would do that. So I've aligned here paintings on the x-axis. So these paintings they're shown on regular intervals here, but there's no time here. This is just painting number. And I'm showing two subjects. Subject 1's ratings between +4 and -4, and on the same set of paintings, here's subject 2. So you can see on some of them they agree, on some of them they diametrically disagree, and on others of them they're going up, down, left, and right. There's a lot of variance. It's a large study. It's over 150 people were done in various kinds of settings. And what you do, though, if you're going to construct and go looking in somebody's brain, is we then take, and this shows a couple of specific pieces of art, we take what's called the hemodynamic response function. That's the way your brain would respond to a point stimulus. Like if I thumped on your brain or shined a light in your eye or made a snap in your ear like this, the hemodynamic response I'm showing you right here. You take this function and you paste it on to the sequence of decisions they made about how much they like something, and you generate for one particular person an expected hemodynamic profile. In other words, this is how subject 1's brain should look as I go looking through it if I saw a region that was modulated according to the value they're going to assign to the art. And then we go fishing through their brain for that. Okay? It's a little bit heavy, sorry, but that's how we go and find the regions. When you go looking through the brain, the first thing you see in the abstract art experiment is you don't use anything special to value things. I'm not going to show you the finger-painted brain here, right? But you see the ventral medial prefrontal cortex as you did here. You see various other regions. In other words, you use the same regions you use to value everything else, okay? Now, Then we're going to ask the canonical question, which is the one that David Korn started this symposium with, which is when somebody gives you a pen with, AstraZeneca on it, are you then able to judge things with AstraZeneca's logo objectively? We went into this thinking the answer was unequivocally no. But it doesn't look that way. It might be that if you're an expert and you're just aware that you could be biased, in fact, the answer's not in. We'll come to that. But in fact, it may spare you from the sponsorship effects I'm going to show you here. Okay. So here we go. We made a bunch of ersatz companies. I had a programmer who likes to make logos. He made these logos. Since we were doing ostensibly behavioral economics, we're not allowed to lie to our subjects. Otherwise, we can't get our papers published. We can't get our papers published anyway, but I don't know what that's about. So I web registered all these names, and I put money into separate accounts. So when I was paying you, because Third Moon decided to pay for the experiment, I was paying you from the Third Moon account. Okay? So, yeah, talk about social networks. So here's how the sponsored experiment goes. Subject sees two logos at the beginning of the experiment, We Cyclers and Third Moon. Sees a second screen that says, the following experiment is sponsored by Third Moon for $300. Third Moon just paid for the experiment, okay? And it's set in juxtaposition early on to We Cyclers. Okay, then as the sequence of paintings is shown, the logos are spatially counterbalanced up here, and counterbalanced as to whether you're seeing a sponsoring logo or a non-sponsoring logo, and we randomize these across the paintings. And then we just ask the question, what happens to your valuation of the painting if it's sitting next to a sponsoring logo? That's what happens. Okay? So your average rating, and this is normed and mean adjusted, of course, but here's what happens to sponsored paintings. And if you notice something, this is actually, I think this is different than 0, right? Yeah. So it actually pushes the other one down. Like there's a kind of resource that's getting distributed across the options. Now, they don't know anything. I mean, they may be sitting there thinking, what are these doing? And in Texas, that's dangerous, right? You could get shot. But I was thinking when I was in the cab coming over here, I lived in Woods Hole for a couple of summers, and I know about Boston drivers. I remember about Boston drivers, but wow, you would be killed in Texas doing all that honking and banging here. It's frightening. Okay, so there's the paintings. In fact, people start developing an affinity for the logos. So much so that Anne started doing debriefing documents because people were saying things like, that one company, that just looked like an evil logo. I mean, they said all kinds of crazy things about the unsponsoring logo. Okay, so whether or not these are implicit effects, and they are, they bubble up to all sorts of things after the fact. Let me jump to the punchline here. The punchline is you don't use any different circuits in your brain to value paintings or to where the sponsorship effect has an effect than you do for anything else. In other words, there's no specific sort of region in which something sitting next to a sponsoring logo is sort of being specially modulated. It's modulating regions that we always see when people are valuing almost anything, but it is modulating them up and down. They do go up. It shifts your whole preference curve over. So paintings that you really disliked are disliked less. Paintings that you liked are liked more. Shifts the entire preference curve over. Okay, we had a student from an MD PhD, who's now an MD PhD student, George Denfield, in the lab during the summer. He's from Tufts, and he asked the following obvious question. Well, what about a mirror offer? What happens when somebody, as they say in Monty Python, gestures in your general direction? But it doesn't complete. So what happens if somebody wants to give you a microloan and some external agency comes in and just prevents it because there's a rule? Okay? Does it leave a warm glow in your nervous system that then affects your preference judgments? Okay? The idea is that a computer comes in after you've been told somebody's going to sponsor the experiment. They block the sponsorship, but we still put the logos next to the paintings, and we ask the question, what happens then? Sorry, I wanted to skip that. Student experiment. So here's a mirror offer experiment set up. Again, two companies are offering to sponsor the experiment. This was one version of it. A little bit later, a computer comes on and says, okay, I'm going to let this guy sponsor the experiment, and then the other one's the unsponsored logo. And we did another version of it like this, where somebody sponsors the experiment, and the computer says, no, I'm going to compensate you normally. Okay. Both of those have an effect. In fact, the effect is profound. I want to just draw your attention to the effect is profound and they seem to be competing with one another. So let me draw your attention to the left here. So this is a company makes no gesture at all. The company makes a gesture that they're going to sponsor, and now the question is, did the other company pay me or did the other company not pay me? I just want to draw your attention to this cell, and this cell. So I make no gesture, we give it a 0. The other company pay me, we give it a negative sign. The idea there is that the data were very confusing when we looked at it at first until we realized these things were interacting with one another. So I make an offer. If you don't make an offer, I get a certain value in your mind. Okay? If I make an offer and the other opposing company makes an offer, it decreases my value. Like there's a resource there, right? If I make an offer and the other company doesn't pay me, then I get the biggest effect. And so it walks you right through this matrix. Here's the least value where there's no offer made. Here's one where the gesture is made and the other company paid me. And here the gesture is made and the other company doesn't pay at all. Just boom, boom, boom. It's a huge effect. Actually, it's dangerous data, right? It gives you a strategy. But we all know that, in a sense. None of this is particularly surprising. So what maneuvers mitigate this? And I'll close with that. We have found at least 2. The first is we went and repeated the experiment using student art from London School of Art that nobody knows, so it wasn't famous art anymore. And then that's what you see on the far left here, where you see the sponsorship effect and controls. This is over the student art. Let me draw your attention to the far right. We then recruited art experts, teachers in the art school at Rice University in Houston, and there's another art school in Houston. We recruited professionals, various docents at the Museum of Fine Art there. Their scores were very close to 0 and modulated around 0, but in fact, as you can see, there's no difference between sponsorship here. One trivial explanation is the art experts hate everything, right? I mean, and actually, dealing with the art experts reminded me of dealing with a patient population of borderline personality disorder patients, so I'm not sure that they didn't hate everything. So that's still an open question. But and then we've run a bevy of meditators, people who have undergone mindfulness training. We're very interested in this, not necessarily as an instructive intervention. I think it may be that people attracted to mindfulness training may come prefigured to not be very subject to the sponsorship effect. But just to show that in the data here, they also don't show a differential sponsorship effect across the paintings, but they liked everything more. So I don't know. So we're doing this now. We couldn't afford it within subject design initially, but we can now afford it, and so we're pursuing that. And it's cheaper, right? I mean, you can either become an art expert and go to a lot of parties, or you can just be really calm. We don't know. We actually think that people on economic games, they play more rationally. These mindfulness training and whatnot, it's a way there's a neural signature for this. We can do servos on this. Anyway, it's a very interesting outcome. So that's our only effort in mitigation. We've now transported these experiments from the art world to the physician decision-making world, where they're making medical judgments on drugs and outcomes for drugs, and the answers just aren't in yet. But we have a grant from the NIH to do that, and I just put up some thinking points for the rest of the symposium. So thanks very much for having me.
Thanks, Reed. Thanks, Mahzarin, for this wonderful background. We're going to take let's take about a 12-minute break, and we're going to come back and hear 3 more papers before we move to our discussion period at the end of the session. So I'm going to start again promptly in 12 minutes.